In 1859, British philosopher John Stuart Mill published an essay called On Liberty, in which he defended freedom as a necessary value to be protected if we are to remain a civilized society. It was his view that those who argued against freedom would end up stifling human potential and weakening the intellect of mankind. In the 21st century, Mill's ideas remain relevant in a world where censorship is increasingly taking over. As much as we might think freedom is something that will always be valued, we should be aware that there are people who would prefer to control us rather than let us think for ourselves. This is especially true as a lot of our interactions these days take place online. No longer is it the government censors who we must be aware of. It is the social media companies who now do this work. That said, we should not see the government or social media companies as some force existing outside of normal society. There are people who want this censorship in place and prefer to live in a world where dissenting voices are silenced. Further, knowing how little tolerance there is for dissent, many of us self-censor so as to avoid the social ostracism of the group. At some point, we might ask ourselves, is it better to stifle dissent and maintain order? Or should we encourage free discussion no matter where the conversation takes us? Going back to the template laid out for us by Mill can be a useful guide to understanding the arguments at stake. First, a brief overview. Mill makes the case that there are a number of forces in society that want to limit our freedom. This includes the tyranny of the majority, the spirit of Puritanism, the natural human desire for control, and the pursuit of national security. Against those who would limit our freedoms, Mill claims that it is not the job of the government to be our parent. We can draw a distinction here between a paternalistic society and a liberal society. Further, he argues that freedom of thought and discussion is good for our intellectual development. Without free thought, our development as human beings will stagnate. Further, he makes the case that freedom will make life more interesting. So, who was John Stuart Mill? He was a British political philosopher and politician. He was the son of James Mill, who believed in the philosophy of utilitarianism, or the idea that society should be so ordered as to provide for the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, John Stuart Mill published the essay we are looking at in 1859, and a few years later, he published another essay defending and explaining his father's ideas. Between these two essays, there is some tension. The philosophy of utilitarianism makes the case that we should be looking out for each other and structuring government accordingly. In contrast, the philosophy presented in On Liberty argues that the government should mind its own business and keep out of the affairs of private individuals. It is not clear that these two competing philosophies can fully exist in harmony with each other. That said, in On Liberty, Mill makes a compelling case for the position that there are forces in society that would like to limit our freedom, and he then argues in favor of a liberal view of society where people are free to do as they see fit so long as they are not harming others. Now, what was the inciting incident that pulled Mill into this debate? It was Mill's view that while democracy appeared at first to be an ideal form of government, he and others realized that there was actually something quite dangerous lurking under the surface of letting society be ruled by the will of the majority. While it might sound good on paper to give everyone a voice to be heard, this could also lead to what has been called the tyranny of the majority. That is to say, if the majority of a population want a rule to be imposed on others, this leaves those with dissenting viewpoints to be essentially oppressed by the rule of the majority. In the face of majority rule, He believed it was important to make room for individual liberties that should be protected no matter what a plurality of the population has to say. One of the focal points of his discussion is the Temperance Movement in Britain and America. Here we have the executive committee of the New Hampshire Women's Christian Temperance Union. Mill wanted to call to our attention this movement of concerned citizens that wanted to make laws prohibiting the use of fermented drinks. For Mill, this was a compelling example to think through how a democratic vote can result in oppressive outcomes. This then gives Mill the space to consider what motivated those who wanted to limit our freedoms, and then work out the case to be made in defense of the freedom of citizens to do as they see fit, even if their behavior might be deemed immoral by some. For us, we should note that while this example is far enough in the past to give us some sense of objectivity, there are lessons to apply to the present as it concerns various efforts to limit the freedom of individuals, even in places where it seems no one else should be concerned. One outcome of Mill's discussion here is to ask the question, what is the role of government? Is the government supposed to be our parent and legislate morality? Or is the government solely there to keep us from harming each other? These disparate views of the role of government can be characterized as paternalism or liberalism. In a paternalistic society, people cannot be trusted to always do the right thing morally and must be managed by others. In a liberal society, people are free to do whatever they want so long as they are not harming others. Mill is ultimately going to make the case in favor of a liberal view of society. It was Mill's view that it is not the government's job to be your parent. Rather, it is your parent's job to be your parent. If you turned out to be an immoral person who cannot handle freedom, that is something you have to work out on your own. It is not the government's responsibility to manage your personal moral affairs. Philosophers and religious leaders have plenty to say about self-control, and it is up to each person to figure out the difference between right and wrong and know their own limits. It is up to us to have a personal sense of morality and self-control. Quoting Mill, "It is not because men's desires are strong that they act ill, it is because their consciences are weak." If you know you have low self-control when it comes to drinking, you have to put the work in to become a more disciplined person. Of course, having self-control and discipline is hard work. It would be a lot easier to have the government simply ban everything that can be harmful. But the net result would be that the government would be treating its citizens like irresponsible children. For Mill, it is not the government's job to be your parent. It is your parent's job to teach you about learning how to conduct yourself as a rational individual. If it turns out that grown adults act like children in public, this is not the fault of the government, but of society itself. So, does Mill want us to be acting like children in public or harming ourselves by doing things we know are bad for us? Well, no, but in his view, the value of freedom is so high, this is the price he is willing to pay so that others can be free. But to those who would prefer to legislate morality, he would reply that this is not the proper form of government. If someone doesn't like what they see in the streets, they need to work hard to educate young people about the difference between right and wrong. The answer for Mill is not greater government oversight, rather it is about better education and parenting. The photograph here, by the way, is from New Year's Eve in Manchester, England in 2015 by Joel Goodman, and is a compelling depiction of what a free society can look like. Now, why should we let people do things that religious people want banned, like drinking alcohol? Well, it is not the government's job to prevent God from being offended. That is God's business. As Mill puts it, leave the offenses of the gods to the care of the gods. Further, it is not the government's job to force its people to be civilized. As we move through the arguments, I leave it up to you to decide if this is the best way to govern a society. Okay, let's talk for a moment about personal privacy. In Mill's view, the strongest argument against a paternalistic form of government is that when the government does interfere, it is likely that it will interfere wrongly and in the wrong place. That is to say, once you give the government the responsibility of legislating morality, there is an increased likelihood that the government will end up involved a lot more in your private affairs than you would like or deem appropriate. One moment they are doing a search of a restaurant where you are having dinner, the next they are monitoring all of your communications for any discussions of illicit activity. And before you know it, they are reading your private communications for their own personal entertainment. Mill would prefer the government leave us alone to make up our own minds about what is moral or immoral. If you make the government your parent, you will end up with the government asking you more questions about your personal affairs than you might be comfortable with. So Mill is making the case that the goal in his essay is to assert one very simple principle, that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. As he puts it, over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. This is a famous line which characterizes the liberal view of government. Mill is going to make the case in defense of three core freedoms. First, liberty of conscience. In the most comprehensive sense, liberty of thought and feeling. Absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical or speculative, scientific, moral, or theological. Second, liberty of tastes and pursuits, of framing the plan of our life to suit our own character, of doing as we like so long as what we do does not harm others. And third, the liberty to unite for any purpose not involving harm to others, the persons combining being supposed to be of full age and not forced or deceived. To be clear, Mill is reserving these freedoms for grown adults in a civilized society. Anticipating potential counterarguments, Mill does not think children should have the freedom to drink alcohol or do whatever they want regardless of any standards of morality. But here we must again note, it is the parent's job to maintain a moral order in the home. Now, in the real world, complexities emerge when you have knowledge that a parent is not maintaining a moral order in the home. But these complexities are set aside as Mill is going to make his core case in defense of a liberal society. Now, there is a phrase that Mill uses that should be highlighted, quote, a distinct and assignable obligation. Remember, Mill was arguing on behalf of what might be considered immoral behavior, drinking alcohol. But does that mean any adult can drink whenever they want? Well, not exactly. At certain points, even adults have a distinct and assignable obligation. A test case here would be that an adult cannot get drunk and then drive home. Further, a parent should not be getting drunk around their children. In these contexts, where an adult has broken a distinct and assignable obligation, the government has a responsibility to step in and enforce some discipline. Here is Mill on this point. I fully admit that the mischief which a person does to himself may seriously affect, both through their sympathies and their interests, those nearly connected with him, and in a minor degree society at large. When, by conduct of this sort, a person is led to violate a distinct and assignable obligation to any other person or persons, the case is taken out of the self-regarding class and becomes amenable to moral disapprobation in the proper sense of the term. So we now have at least two restrictions on absolute freedom. We are free to do whatever we want so long as we are not harming others. Also, we are free to do whatever we want so long as we are not breaking a distinct and assignable obligation to someone else. Okay, so Mill is going to spend some time laying out arguments in defense of freedom. So far, we have seen that we do not want the government getting involved in our personal affairs because it might intervene in places or at times we do not like. We have also seen the case that it is not the government's job to legislate personal morality or make sure that God goes unoffended. We will see a few more arguments in favor of freedom elsewhere in the analysis. For now, let's look at Mill's explanation of why there are people out there who would seek to limit our freedom. As we have seen, there is the morality police and the tyranny of the majority. More on them in a moment. For now, we should not overlook a subtle yet honest point regarding those who would limit our freedom. National security. Mill acknowledges that in a society like ancient Sparta, citizens were not allowed to drink alcohol because they had to be ready to be on guard for the nation state at a moment's notice. An intoxicated society is a weak society, and a weak society is vulnerable to attack from without and decay from within. Here is how he describes ancient Sparta. The regulation of every part of private conduct by public authority on the ground that the state had a deep interest in the whole bodily and mental discipline of every one of its citizens, a mode of thinking which may have been admissible in small republics surrounded by powerful enemies, in constant peril of being subverted by foreign attack or internal commotion. How does Mill deal with this historical fact? He makes the case that this sort of thinking no longer applies in the modern world. Civilians are not all soldiers, so we can make a distinction between civil society and martial society. That said, I leave it up to you to decide if the benefit of living in a free society can come with a cost in terms of national security and personal discipline. Okay, let's get back to this notion of the tyranny of the majority and the value of free thought and discussion. It was Mill's contention that public opinion now rules the world, and he spends a significant amount of time making the case in favor of free thought and discussion against those who would prefer to stifle dissent. This debate remains relevant today, as we know that so much of our public discourse happens online, and what is said online is now subject to social media censorship. A compelling aspect of Mill's analysis here is not just his arguments in favor of free thought and discussion, but also an exploration of the thinking behind those who would seek to limit the free thought and discussion of others. So we like to tell ourselves that everyone is rational, that people act for good reasons based on logic and evidence. It is Mill's claim that people are not always rational. Now, sometimes people act based on reasons, but there are other motivating forces at play. For Mill, these include acting based on prejudices or superstitions, social affections or antisocial ones, people's envy or jealousy, arrogance or contemptuousness, but most commonly their desires or fears for themselves, their legitimate or illegitimate self-interest, class interests, and its feelings of class superiority. Also, the servility of mankind towards the supposed preferences or aversions of their temporal masters or of their gods. All of these various motivations can push people to want to limit the freedom of others. Here's Mill. Wherever there is an ascendant class, a large portion of the morality of the country emanates from its class interests and its feelings of class superiority. Another grand, determining principle of the rules of conduct, both in act and forbearance, which have been enforced by law or opinion, has been the servility of mankind towards the supposed preferences or aversions of their temporal masters or of their gods. This servility, though essentially selfish, is not hypocrisy. It gives rise to perfectly genuine sentiments of abhorrence. It made men burn magicians and heretics. Now, when we think of the phrase witch hunt, we often imagine the Salem witch trials, where young women were accused of witchcraft by the ruling elite. But to this day, there are times when individuals have been persecuted for views that go against the orthodox mindset. And the fervor with which such dissenters are attacked can sometimes take on the feeling of a witch hunt. It is not that dissenters are just crazy, wrong, or irrelevant. It is that they must be punished, ostracized, or even destroyed in the name of social cohesion. All of which is to say that at the core of paternalism is the religious spirit of Puritanism. There is this idea that there is a real difference between right and wrong, and it is not just up to each person to figure it out for themselves. Rather, these views must be publicly enforced by the morality police. It is not enough for the individual to live a good life. Everyone must be forced to obey the moral standards of society as well. Now, Mill digs a bit further here with a diagnosis of the human condition. It is his claim that in all of us there exists a natural desire for control. It is the natural, quote, disposition of mankind to impose their own opinions and inclinations as a rule of conduct on others. There's something fundamental about the human experience that once we think we know the difference between right and wrong, we want everyone else to agree with us. Now, in opposition to these forces, Mill is going to make a number of arguments in defense of each person's right to dissent from the majority, and not only think for themselves, but speak for themselves, and also have the freedom to associate with those they want to associate with. Why is free discussion valuable? For Mill, we must always leave open the possibility that we might be wrong. By allowing for free discussion, we leave open the possibility that others might show us where we have gone wrong, and we can then learn from our mistakes. Without free discussion, we could continue to make the same errors again and again. Further, we would end up intellectually stagnant. Here is how Mill puts it. Both teachers and learners go to sleep at their post as soon as there is no enemy in the field. Much more of the meaning of even of these would have been understood, and what was understood would have been far more deeply impressed on the mind if the man had been accustomed to hear it argued pro and con by people who did understand it. Note here, we need to have free debate because even if you're correct, when you have to debate your ideas publicly and defend your position, this strengthens your own understanding and confidence in your views. Further, when others are allowed to listen to such debates, everyone benefits from the intellectual activity. Here's Mill again. He is capable of rectifying his mistakes by discussion and experience. Not by experience alone, there must be discussion to show how experience is to be interpreted. Wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument. But facts and arguments, to produce any effect on the mind, must be brought before it. Very few facts are able to tell their own story without comments to bring out their meaning. Again, we must allow for free discussion to allow for the continued intellectual development of mankind. Without free discussion, there will be less understanding and we will stagnate as a society. We can talk about scientific understanding, but Mill also talks about wisdom. Quote, "In the case of any person whose judgment is really deserving of confidence, how has it become so? Because he's kept his mind open to criticism of his opinions and conduct. Because it has been his practice to listen to all that could be said against him. Because he's felt that the only way in which a human being can make some approach to knowing the whole of a subject is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion, and studying all modes in which it can be looked at by every character of mind. No wise man ever acquired his wisdom in any mode but this, nor is it in the nature of human intellect to become wise in any other manner. The steady habit of correcting and completing his own opinion by collating it with those of others, so far from causing doubt and hesitation in carrying it into practice, is the only stable foundation for a just reliance on it. We become wise by listening to those who would disagree with us and taking seriously those views we might not initially understand or even agree with. If one thinks one knows everything and there's nothing to learn, one will never be able to grow as a person or achieve wisdom. Here we have a scene from Pink Floyd's The Wall. A great movie. We're going to have a couple images coming up from this film. You have here the authoritarian schoolmaster who demands obedience to his instruction and humiliates the student here for writing poems in his notebook. But is this how we will progress as a society? By blind obedience to authority? For Mill, quote, "If the teachers of mankind are to be cognizant of all that they ought to know, everything must be free to be written and published without restraint." The schoolmaster here might have learned something about life had he given himself the chance to open his mind to the value of poetry. Is the schoolmaster always correct? Does the schoolmaster have nothing else to learn? Well, if there is no free speech, one assumes all knowledge has been obtained and there is nothing new to learn. As Mill puts it, all silencing of discussion is an assumption of infallibility. By contrast, Mill would have us be more humble with our confidence in everything we think we know. In another image from The Wall, we see what happens if the schoolmaster gets his way. Not only will everyone be obedient, but we will also become distorted versions of ourselves, wearing the mask of uniformity to cover up any individuality we once had. If we're not allowed to think for ourselves, we will no longer really be human beings. If we all believe what we're told to believe, then we will not need our human intellect. As Mill puts it, he who lets the world, or his own portion of it, choose his plan of life for him has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. Censorship makes us less human. If everyone is required to have the same thoughts and the same behavior, society will not be a collection of individuals. Instead, each person will be another cog in the machine, or as the song goes, another brick in the wall. Why is freedom valuable? Not only does it allow for the full flourishing of the human experience, but it gives us room to become the best possible versions of ourselves. Here's Mill. It is not by wearing down into uniformity all that is individual in themselves, but by cultivating it and calling it forth, within the limits imposed by the rights and interests of others, that human beings become a noble and beautiful object of contemplation. By the same process, human life also becomes rich, diversified, and animating, furnishing more abundant aliment to high thoughts and elevating feelings, and strengthening the tie which binds every individual to the race by making the race infinitely better and worth belonging to. In proportion to the development of his individuality, each person becomes more valuable to himself and is therefore capable of being more valuable to others. In contrast to a gray and bland, uniform society, Mill envisions a colorful world of variety and difference that gives us new opportunities and experiences around every corner. This is the ideal view of a free and liberated society. Here's Mill. As it is useful that while mankind are imperfect, there should be different opinions, so is it that there should be different experiments of living, that free scope should be given to varieties of character, short of injury to others, and that the worth of different modes of life should be proved practically when anyone thinks fit to try them. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover here shows us the possibilities that can result from living in a free society. Some people will be poets, some musicians. Some will be actors, some athletes, and some authors. There are limitless possibilities. If we allow people to engage in experiments of living, we will live in a world of rich diversity. This is the dream of living in a free society. Earlier, we characterized the difference in visions between paternalism and liberalism, where in one world the government is your parent, and in another you are free to do with your life what you see fit. I want to draw your attention to a subtle point Mill makes about what it means to live in a free society. It was Mill's view that liberalism can only emerge in that advanced stage of civilization where dissent is tolerated. He contrasts this with backward states of society where people cannot handle dissenting viewpoints. In a civil society, people are free to have different viewpoints, while a society that cannot tolerate different viewpoints is what he calls, quote, a backward state of society, incapable of intellectual development. It was Mill's claim that until a society emerged out of brute tribalism, they could not be allowed to have freedom of speech. It was only through the gradual emergence of the value of freedom when society matured to the point of being a civil society that people could then be allowed to have freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and freedom of association. Here's Mill, quote, "For the same reason, we may leave out of consideration those backward states of society. Liberty, as a principle, has no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind had become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. So, if a society does not allow dissent, it is a backward state. To the extent that we encourage or allow censorship to take hold in our society, we face the risk of regressing into a backward state of being. Rather than being a civilization that can handle different viewpoints, calls for censorship are really calls for intellectual regression that would return us to a more tribal, superstitious, and primordial state of being." Taking all of this into consideration, we can ask ourselves what the costs and benefits are of living in a liberal and free society, as opposed to a backward state of society as previously noted. First off, in a free society, there are no public restrictions on the morality of grown adults. If people want to drink alcohol and be immoral, that is fine so long as they are not hurting others. In a backward state of society, people are forbidden from enjoying things like alcohol because even though some people have self-discipline, they cannot be trusted because there are others who have no self-control. Now, that said, in a free society where people can do whatever they want, we must acknowledge that there would be a potential for weaker national security. Now, Mill made the case that this was no longer relevant as we are not Spartans sleeping in tents on the frontiers of our society, forever on guard from outside attack. But interpreted more broadly, is it not the case that people may become weaker if there is less enforcement of discipline and structure in society as a whole? Something to consider. And a free society will have freedom of debate and discussion with stronger intellectual development, while backward states of society will stagnate intellectually as a result of censorship. Does it make sense to say that censorship leads to intellectual stagnation? If one lived under a censorship regime, would they be willing to acknowledge their own intellectual limitations? Now, this last point is a sum total of these outcomes. A free society will have a diverse range of human experience. As noted, some people will become authors, some will be musicians, some will become athletes, and so on. But if we are drawing contrasts between backward states of society and Mill's ideal free society, one could say that there would be a difference in terms of social cohesion. Now, we can call uniformity conformity, or requiring everyone be bricks in the wall, but we can also call this social cohesion. The point here is that while there are a range of compelling arguments in favor of a liberal political philosophy, it is not without its costs. Allowing for freedom of thought, discussion, and action will lead to intellectual development and a rich tapestry of human experience. But it may come at the cost of national security and social cohesion. I should note here that while Mill published this essay in 1859, and many societies in the West pursued a liberal political philosophy, there remain populations in the world who are not as eager to go down the path of liberalism. Some societies do not see the benefit as worth the cost and would prefer to maintain a strict view on morality, national security, and social cohesion. Much like the original example of drinking alcohol, nothing in life can be done without consequences. Back to our summary of Mill's discussion. Mill claimed that there are forces aligned against freedom, and there are good reasons to defend freedom despite any potential downsides. While there are those who would want to use the tyranny of the majority to enforce morality or national security or placate their natural desire for control, we should resist such forces. We should not turn the government into our parent, nor should we stifle freedom of thought and discussion and give our minds over to the censors. We must allow for freedom of thought, discussion, and behavior so as to allow for the continued intellectual development of mankind. It will make life more interesting and allow for the greatest development of the human experience. Now, for those who stayed until the end, I will comment briefly on what appears here and its relevance to our discussion. What we have here is a panopticon invented by Jeremy Bentham, a friend of the Mill family. Its first use would be in a prison. This is a setup where the prison guard can view all of the inmates from a central tower, seeing into the lives of all those under his care. This idea can be extended, of course, into the world of censorship. In a totalitarian society, the government is constantly monitoring your communications for any deviance from what is deemed acceptable. Further, each citizen becomes a tool of the government, monitoring the activities of each other for adherence to the party line. Along with all of the arguments Mill set forth in defense of freedom, we should also note that if we're all expected to act the same, speak the same, and think the same, we might as well be living in a giant prison where we are all each other's guards, maintaining strict discipline and obedience to the status quo. In contrast to the colorful world Mill imagines could be possible in a free society, we should remember another path could be this world where we are all monitoring each other at all times. As always, thank you for your attention and participation. I look forward to our class discussion where we will all be free to decide for ourselves the best path forward.